Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, the LinkedIn Live series from My Meeting Support, featuring Dr. Martin Duffy and Dr. Paul Nunez-Dia.
Hey, welcome, dear viewers. It's so good to be here again with all of you for another episode of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. As always with me, Martin Duffy, my co-host. Martin, you like to say hello to the viewers?
Yeah,
I'll put you in the spot here.
I'm well into retirement at this stage now, loving every minute of it. But it's always nice to have conversations with practitioners from around the globe in areas related to and associated with organizational meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. And this time we are so lucky to have with us Nancy White. For most of you, a renowned facilitator, community leader, prolific author. She's contributing a lot to the world of what we call facilitation, right? But there's a lot more than to it that as we're going to discover right now. So Nancy is connected to the movement of liberating structures. We are very curious to learn more about liberating structures. And what got my attention recently, I saw published the field book on liberating structures. So wow, what were the learnings from the field we can get from Nancy here today? So without further ado, I hand over to Martin, because Martin, we have a tradition in our programs.
We sure do, yeah, Nancy. we always like to invite our guests at the opening comments to leave the microphone to yourself, that maybe there's something about yourself from your past or from your professional work or from your interests or hobbies that people might not be overly familiar with, but that you're happy to share with us. Anything at all. And we'll just take the conversation from there.
Well, I used to play in a bluegrass band.
Oh.
I played guitar and sang harmonies.
Oh, fantastic. Hey, when we go offline, Nancy, we might just have a session. Huh?
and you know, a band, you can tell when it's in sync and when it's not in sync.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And there's have been lessons from those years that continue to stay with me even into retirement.
Fantastic. You know, that's a really interesting segue, Nancy, because we've had numerous guests, and all of them that have mentioned their background in music have always been able to correlate that into that idea that you've just mentioned of synchronizing, of meshing with people, of working in tandem with others. It's a fascinating aspect that actually brings us straight into the concept of meetings, because is that not what meetings are meant to be about? Bringing people into alignment, into harmony, into engagement, but the
or creative dissonance.
Well, so long as we have the creative before the dissonance, we're all in business for sure. But liberating structures, Nancy, it's a concept. Before Paul mentioned that as a topic or a theme for this conversation, I'd never actually heard of it. So perhaps you could start by just giving us your take on, well, what is it? What does it mean?
Well, liberating structures is, for me, a pattern language. Okay, it is understanding what it is we were trying to do when we're in a group together. And I'm not talking just from a perspective of facilitation, but of active participation of any person in the design and the execution of working together, being together, playing together, doing together. If we are attentive to some basic things, some microstructures, we can figure out then how to adapt whatever methodology we're using to work in any particular context. So I first heard of liberating structures when Keith McCandless, who's one of the two godfathers with Henry Lemanowitz, I always mispronounce his name. I'm going to go to my grave with regret of how I have never mastered people's names. They were working with mostly corporate clients and noticing when things worked or when things didn't work. And they started describing what they were seeing. And one day, Keith, who lives in Seattle, as do I, said, can I come over to your house and I'll bring some chocolate, and I want to show you this thing I'm working on. And Keith brought over a couple of chapters of the original Liberating Structures book, which came out about 13 years ago. And I read it and I said, oh, what you've really done is you've done a better job of describing how to do any particular facilitation approach. So in other words, old wine in new bottles. So I did not see it. I did not understand it. I did not see it.
Okay.
Well, Keith is a very optimistic person and a very generous and kind person. So he'd keep on inviting me to these sessions where either he was using liberating structures or he was introducing liberating structures. And midway through, he go, and Nancy will demo this one. Like, what the heck? That's not how I do it. First key thing, that's not how I do it, right? Yeah. We all have our ways of doing things. But then one day he said, what we're really looking at is we don't want to over-control groups. We don't want to under-control groups. Over-control groups are the standard structures of giving a speech, status updates, things that are very rigid and usually are controlled by one or more people who have power over the rest of the people. So I have to sit and listen to you. Right now, whoever's listening to this has to sit and listen to me. I have some power right now, right?
Yeah.
And then there's under control, which our community lovingly calls the goat rodeo. Have you ever seen baby goats playing, jumping on things, jumping off things, and running into each other, and but don't get anything done. They're having fun. They're playing, which is beautiful. Yeah. The over control people there are reveling in their power. Fine. But that's not where the work happens, right? The work happens in the space between over-controlled and under-controlled. And something went off in my brain with that concept that was like, oh. And being able to slide upon that continuum, depending on what it is you're trying to do. When you're trying to converge on a decision, you might get into a more controlled situation. But if you're trying to understand a complex setting, you don't want to go there, right? You're going to miss all the opportunity that's on the lesser controlled side. So that was the first breakthrough. So I said, nah, it's not old wine in new bottles. It is a reframing of group process. So there's the 5 design elements that are part of liberating structures, which are invitation, and has to do with what opportunities we're trying to work on together and making progress. The second is space and materials. So how and where we come together, and that used to be at the time when I was learning this face to face. Now it's online mostly. The third is how participation is distributed, and this is a really essential one in that over control under control thing. And also, we can come back to this, but it's not about the facilitator, right? Yeah. It's about how everyone engages and experiences that possibility of using their power, contributing their power. The fourth one is group configuration. So we're not always in plenary. We're always alternating between small group, large group, between individual reflection time and conversation time, which we can come back to. This is how it also allows us each to engage in ways that work for us. And then finally, the steps and the timing. You go from point A to point B, you're going to do this first, you're going to do that second. So this is a pattern language, right? I don't know if you've ever, there's the group works deck. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That was done by a bunch of people up here in the Pacific Northwest of the US, probably 15 years ago. And there's a card deck, which is really lovely. You can find that link for you to put in later if you want. And when you can notice the patterns, when you can describe the patterns, then you have the opportunity to change the patterns. So liberating structures gives us a repertoire of things we can do together that are described through those microstructures, that if we run them just like they're described, we follow it precisely, we can do it with most of the 43 structures, 33 old, 10 new. Most of us can pick up and run that thing, and we can watch someone do it. We can run that thing. It can be simple enough. At the same time, this is rich, fertile ground for adapting in complex situations. If I tweak the invitation, I'm going to change what happens with the rest of the microstructure. If I change how participation is distributed, it's going to change. If I run it backwards, if I take the steps and run them backwards, I'm going to get something unique and still related to that pattern. So then it becomes like that's the water we're swimming in. And so I'll stop there, because to me, liberating structures aren't just a bunch of methods. They're a way of being with each other and a way of seeing beyond the perspective of a facilitator, but seeing the perspective of each individual and the whole group, and what we could achieve. What higher order goal could we actually get to if we reach that state of being able to be with each other? And to me, that's the promise. And it doesn't always work, right? But when we notice the pattern, we can figure out what to do differently the next time and the next time and the next time. And this is particularly relevant when you're in complex settings. They work fine in simple settings, but they're really not necessary in simple settings. If we know it takes A plus B equals C, we don't need to, you know?
Yeah.
Right. But when it's complex and we don't know fully where we're going, we have to move to that iteratively with, you know, the old learning loops and everything in there. And we have to be able to understand what we want to push on in the system to move things forward to where we're trying to go, or redefine where it is we're trying to go.
So there's two things that I'd pick up on there, Nancy, that you said. One is these 5 key elements. So there's 5 key steps, which as you outline them sound a little like sequential steps in getting your head around the setup, the group, the organization, or whatever. You also mentioned 46. I think you mentioned 46.
43.
43. So that 43 elements, and you said, was it 13 of them are new?
10.
10 new.
You just have a different math, that's all.
It's translation across the Atlantic.
We lose 3 in the distance.
So those 5 elements versus those 43 key points, what relates them? What differentiates them? How do both of them fit into the liberating structures concept?
So can I screen share in this platform?
Sure. You can.
I think
We have here a studio mode for screen sharing. Let me check.
okay.
This is the one.
Let me see if this comes up.
I see it here. Yes, I have your screen here.
Okay.
And we are using the demo mode in the studio. Yeah.
I think there's a couple layers here. One is, these are the 5 microstructures that work in concert, not in sequence, right? So this is how I understand the liberating structure. So this is one of the foundational structures, 1, 2, 4, all, which if you're an educator, you might call it think, pair, share. You will recognize these patterns, right?
Okay. Yeah.
They're not, you know, a couple of them are really unique, but most of them come from a long history of trying things together. So you work these things, you address them in sequence, but you don't execute them in sequence. So when I'm designing, okay, so when we start, we're going to gather tonight at 5 o'clock to figure out the pie festival for our little town, because we want to have a festival of pies this summer. So the invitation might be, join us tonight to dream about what the pie festival, this year's pie festival, might look like. And then in my head, I'll ask myself, and we'll know we've made progress when we've set a date and we have an initial invitation for the pie festival. And that may be negotiated with people in advance, or it may be me just throwing it into the table, depending on how formal or informal this structure is. So when I think about the meeting, the space and materials. So I think we're going to need some Post-it notes. And I just want to have chairs, not tables, because I don't want to have people stuck and make it hard for them to move between their groups. And frankly, this pattern is present in almost all the structures, which is don't nail down behind a lecture stand or get people stuck around a table where they can't hear each other across the table, or they're stuck in groups of only 2 or only 8, right? So flexibility. Participation distribution. Well, I know there's a lot of people who have different feelings about the Pie Festival, and I want to make sure everyone is heard. So I have to make sure that the dominators have space to be in small groups where they won't dominate, frankly. So I want to alternate between large and small groups. And I want to acknowledge there's some expertise in the room. and give them some time to speak, but not let that become the only pattern. So that's, that's a microstructure, which is control from the front of the room. For this particular structure, my group configuration is set. I start, alone, and then in pairs, and then in quartets, and then in all. So the group configuration really reflects the structure of 1, 2, 4 all. And then I like to have a run sheet because I'm getting old and I forget things, which says at what time, what structure, who's leading it, what are the prompts that I need to have ready, and how long is, each of those steps going to take it. And if you know something well, you don't need that. Sometimes there's no need for it. Sometimes there's a need for it. When I'm co-designing and co-hosting, my run sheet is essential because we don't have to stop and check and telegraph too much to each other. We know that you're going to start the breakout room. I'm going to put the prompt in the chat, blah, 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 blah. So the 5 elements of 1, 2, 4 all basically teach me how to do the structure. But you see, they're all kind of preparatory. The only ones that are actually sequential are steps and timing.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
That's
So
really interesting.
there was a second question you asked, and I already forgot it.
It then goes to the 43 points and how they relate to those microstructures.
So every structure on the website, you don't have to buy the book, but I hope you do. Every structure has one of those pictures on the website that shows you what the microstructures are for that particular element. So it helps you initially figure out how to run the structure, but it also helps you begin to learn the pattern language without hitting you over the head with it. Because there's only so much you can, when I first started doing liberating structures, I go, oh, these are well-described facilitation methods. That would be how I describe it. And then over time, I realized there's a way that they link up together, and we call it stringing, which allows me not only to plan my meeting more efficiently, to convey it to my co-facilitator more, to telegraph it more efficiently, but it also gives me the idea to think, if this produces a particular thing, we go on to the next one already planned. But if this doesn't produce what we need for this one, I can pull in a different structure. I don't have to, I don't have to people stick with their agendas even when it's broken, because I got to stick to my agenda. I got to stick to my timing. And this gives you a way to be flexible without getting too anxious about it. For those people with less experience, it allows them to say, oh, okay, I can do this instead of that, instead of panicking, right? Especially when a meeting goes, when people are disagreeing, there's usually, or they're not talking. I've got to do something different because what I was going to do next isn't going to work at this current moment in time. So this idea that you could string structures was my next kind of learning loop, old wine, new bottles, really clear instructions, stringing. And all of a sudden, the layers of liberating structure started revealing themselves to me, which came to the next level, which is, this is really useful in complex situations. So I'm kind of repeating a message I said earlier, but that makes a difference in what a group can do. It can lead them to get to higher, what we call higher order goals, instead of just the deliverable for process A or process Z, right? So to go back to the 33 were the things that Henry and Keith found worked over and over again, right? They were kind of the baseline things. And some of them were really well developed, and some of them were not as well developed in the first iteration. They were well developed in their heads, but the practice hadn't been. So when one person practices by themselves, they build up this huge bank of tacit knowledge about how to do something. When you teach someone to do it, then you have to go like, oh. And when you're trying to spread it through written description, it's even harder. And so what really motivated the book in the first place was liberating structures online during the pandemic. And it was amazing how quickly all these things we didn't think we could do online, we were doing online. And we wanted to write a guide to how to do liberating structures online. But when we started writing it, we realized in the 13 years since the first book was out, the community of the network of practitioners had refined and evolved the practice in the hands of many people, not just a few like Keith and Henry or the early adopters, right? It became something that everybody had skin in the game. And when we went back to write, we were going to write like, here's how you do 1, 2, 4 face to face. Here's how you do it online. We were going to do them side by side. We realized that they were actually, when you describe them at their clearest and simplest, there was very little that was unique. There's a couple of structures that don't run well online, and there's a couple of structures that I think work better online.
Yeah.
But to disentangle that, we realized we needed to update the original 33 and make the language clearer and cleaner. And like, how much detail do you put? How much detail do you not put? How many variations do you put versus not? I mean, this is the author's dilemma forever. But as we were doing them, we also realized that the community had been developing their own structures, because once you understand those 5 microstructures, right, you can dream up your own thing.
Yeah.
And we told people, write it up, test it with your colleagues. And some people did, but that's a lot of work. So we did the work of taking some of the other structures and, getting them up to speed in a way to describe. And it was like abandoning some of your children, because there was about 25 potential ones we could have put in there. And in the end, we put in the ones we liked. Keith would probably have a much more clearly stated intellectual view of why we included what. But when we look at the repertoire, we're saying, is there anything this repertoire isn't fulfilling?
Yeah.
And there's some things that aren't as well expressed, or if we tweaked a structure, would be able to fulfill that need. So some people talked about, how can you better develop a plan? And there's a million methods for strategic planning. But when you're strategic planning in a complex environment, that's a little bit different. Maybe it's a lot different. So not working, KNOT, was included in the repertoire because we found it very useful, both from that, how do you get just enough disentanglement to figure your next step, and getting the next steps done. And the other thing that arose in that was, how do we evaluate if we're making progress? So in the book and in the writing of the 10 new ones and the updating of the 33 old ones, we started thinking about what are prompts for ourselves to check to see if we're doing, if we got, how do you say that in English? If structure A delivered what you need for the next structure. And so we're pulling in elements of developmental evaluation into it. And I think that's really a frontier for Keith and I, is how to do more of that. So maybe that's the next book. I don't know. But I'm rambling here. I'm going to stop for a second.
No, you're making sense in my head, but I've got a very specific question. So at least 3 times since we've started, you've mentioned complex situations. So what constitutes a complex situation as you would understand it?
Classically, it's where you cannot predict the outcome. So complicated is, where you have the expertise, you can predict the outcome, and you're pulling everybody along with you, right?
Yeah.
They're filling in the blanks, but there is some sense. So you know where you're going, you have a clear sense of how you get there. Complex is, you have a sense of direction, but you are not certain how you're going there. So you want to make experimental tries into there. And there's lots of language that different people and organizations use, that, you have to try in order to more clearly understand something. And strategic planning, when you look beyond, these days it's beyond 4 weeks, what's going to happen in 6 weeks? My God, that's so far away. And everything will have changed by then. You have to have a completely different stance about how you direct yourselves towards that future and how you adapt as you go, because there's a good chance where you were going isn't exactly where you need to go, but you're not going to discover that until you're partway down that path. And so liberating structures gives us a way to reveal the different facets of things, to not prematurely close on a solution. I think, that's one of the biggest risks these days, is how do I know when to foreclose on a decision or not? Yeah. And the answer is not binary. So you're always exploring the edges.
Yeah. No, that question is always context specific, because you can't predetermine that. My second question, because there's other things that I'd like to develop, but just to I suppose bottom out the liberating structures concept, as you've described it so far, it sounds like it's very oriented toward the facilitator, and it's sounding to me like it's a framework within which the facilitator can make sense out of the evolving situation in front of them. Now, that's how it's sounding to me. My question then is, to what extent do the participants need to have any awareness, or even some awareness or no awareness, of liberating structures? Or is this really just a conceptual and a practical toolkit for the practitioner facilitators?
Yes and no to all those. So at one level, it is a way to design and run a meeting.
Yeah.
Right? What is interesting is it gives everyone a pen to be authors. So you can have the group be part of your design team.
Yeah.
Or you could have the group just walk in the room and you have designed it and you run it. Rarely do I tell people, oh, now we're going to do liberating structure XYZ, because nobody gives a flip, right? But when they start and something different happens and they're going like, oh, something different just happened. What just happened? That's when building the sense of the shared group's capability to understand its own patterns and to change its own patterns and to direct its own patterns begins to emerge. So groups who use it over time become more self-directed, right?
Yeah.
And, then the facilitator is kind of like keeping time and, just, oh, we ran out of paper. Maybe we'll get some more of this, they really step out of the middle of it. And you said something really important to me, which was the facilitator making sense of things. So I am was a great sense maker. I could absorb and capture and synthesize and show it back to people, and they go like, wow, but I was doing them a disservice in many ways, because the things we make sense of for ourselves end up having more power than something someone made sense for us. So there's something performative and satisfying of having someone come up and, like I used to graphically record and facilitate it at the same time, which I would not recommend. It's insane. But people go like, oh, and then they take that result away, but I've robbed them of something. So I think
ownership is that
it's ownership, but also understanding, right? So this whole thing now about AI making us stupid.
Oh yeah.
In a way, there's something related there to overworking the sense making and the directing of the facilitator. So I think there's like a different language that we need, which is, it's not a train conductor. It's not the guy waving the flag on the side. I don't know what the metaphor is, but it's not quite the same as our familiar model of a facilitator. And it means for the facilitator giving up control, which, okay. So I'll just call out both Keith and I, is that we're pretty smart people. So we can see things sometimes in a group, and to get out of their way sometimes causes us discomfort, or we fall, as what's the expression, we snap back to our old behaviors of experts. So I think expertise is value, but experts can be problematic. And generally when we live up to the principles of liberating structures, people have more power to use what they know, because the knowledge is often right there in the room and we've not been listening to it. Excuse me.
There's as I've listened to you describing elements from the facilitator's point of view and equally from the participant's point of view, you're resonating in my head the idea of open space, the principles or the practice of open space. Am I inferring correctly there? Is there a sense of overlap between how open space operates as a facilitative mode and the application of liberating structures?
So there's one liberating structure called options place, which is inspired from open space, which is when we create the conditions for people to make their own agendas, we can often go further than if we created the agenda for them. So philosophically, that is very much shared. I'm also an open space practitioner, have, been able to learn at the feet of many of the previous generation of facilitators. And there are other facilitation practices which I still practice and appreciate. I think the difference now is I just now look at it through the 5 microstructures, right? And some people, the openness of open space still challenges them.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
for them, do you create a little more structure, right? And I see some people saying, "Oh, no, don't do that." I don't really care whether you agree or disagree. You do what works for you. It's not a dogma.
yeah,
But if we can discuss and describe and reflect on what happened or what we want to happen with some shared language, then really interesting conversations happen.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's okay.
Let me just interject here, Martin, for a minute. I know that we have a string of questions and we have to extract a lot from our guest here today. I mean, I'm delighted to have Nancy here with us. But just this morning, I had a conversation with Charlotte, my colleague from Denmark. She was talking about how difficult it is for the managers at large, right? Let's talk about the management world and the company, the organizational life, where managers sometimes struggle to understand the difference between content and process. This is, a discovery we were sharing and commenting. And now, of course, this language about process is very, very useful for any manager that wants to have a go on a different type of organizing this next meeting. I find this very interesting. It democratizes the access to the role of facilitator, which in the past was just for these guru experts, right? But anybody can facilitate a meeting thanks to liberating structure. That's my stake. Martin, over to you.
I just want to add on something is I think we still have to socialize the idea that, we all play a role in the success of a meeting.
I
Peter
love
Block,
that.
I was graphically recording at a meeting, and Peter Block came into the room and he was talking about the work they were doing in Cincinnati. And he goes like, okay, here's where I start with those meetings. If this meeting were to be an absolute failure, what is your role in that failure? And I kind of sat back on my heels and went,
oh, way to go.
Did you really say that?
Yeah, cool.
I borrow that and credit it because I think we have given up agency as participants. A participant is a lesser thing than the manager or the facilitator. And that's a deep cultural practice that, sometimes we take it into the meeting room and it's rejected because it's dangerous. It's heretical. But when people do take it on, I mean, you should interview Keith. He's got some great stories in the healthcare
world. Please bring him, introduce him to us. We'd love to have him here. Yeah.
He was working in healthcare and they were trying to stop the spread of antibiotic resistant bacteria infections. And they brought the whole team into a mock-up of a room and they watched what patterns people did as the doctor went to the patient, as the person from maintenance came and emptied the bag of, the protective suits. And they used chocolate syrup to be the stand-in for the bacteria. So you could physically see where the bacteria spread. And it was really, and they found breakthrough points where they could change simple things and it would make a huge difference, right? But the leader of the group was really challenged because they couldn't tell people what to do. They had to remove the barriers that were keeping people from doing what they knew they should do. They discovered they could do. And it's a commitment to learning with and from each other on an ongoing basis. I think about the work of Bev and Etienne Wenger Trainer, who, Paul, I know you know because they're near you, south of Lisbon. But they talk about social learning and learning to make a difference. And I think the scaffolding of learning to make a difference really, really complements the scaffolding of liberating structures.
I have to take note of that. I don't know them, and they're so close to me. Oh, yeah.
Oh my God, you need to know them. Bev and Etienne Wenger Trainer. And if you go to Wenger Trainer and you look at their value creation framework, it gives another way for us to understand the dynamics of people in organizations. So we're no longer messing with process here. We're also messing with an organism, with its strengths, its weaknesses, its habits, it's wanting to go back to the way we do it. And in this time of rapid change, I'm finding people are holding even tighter to pass things because it's the only thing they have to anchor them.
Absolutely, yeah. But you, Nancy, you've touched on something for me that I think is pretty important. And Paul, your point there and your question, and actually used the phrase democratization. But so the principles of liberating structures, if they encounter a management mindset that is not disposed towards democratization, that is more disposed towards autocracy rather than democracy, is more disposed towards dictation rather than participation. Is there a mismatch then? Is there a scenario where liberating structures just isn't going to work in this place, so let's not bother trying? Or have I missed something?
Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Personally, an optimist.
So in my experience, I have seen shifts even in fairly autocratic situations, but I would suggest it's more of a guerrilla move, or pardon my kind of but it's facilitation.
I love that term. Yeah.
That you're really trying to slide a little variant in. And then the other thing is, and again, this goes, if you look at the Wenger Trainer Value Creation Framework, if you don't notice what's happening at the small, immediate scale, you have no chance of making a difference at the larger systemic level, right?
Yeah.
And so if you think about, if we just did 1, 2, 4 all together, and you heard from someone you've never heard from before, we might say, let's stop for a minute and see what just happened. So we'll do a little bit of developmental evaluation. And when people are prompted to notice what was different when something was run with a structure versus, a lecture, they go like, and you don't push it any further. The next time you do one, you just that tiny moment of what was changed. And at the end of the meeting, one of the things we're working on is sort of the variation of triangle evaluation, where people, how have our connections changed? How have our development of new possibilities done? And what, actual ideas are we putting into action? And you can change those 3 questions. We're playing with those 3 to see if they work across as many contexts as possible. And so one of the things is I created a new relationship. Then the prompt can be, what are you going to do to maintain what was created today? I'm going to have coffee with Paul and Martin next week, right? If we don't open awareness and possibility of the tiny things we can do right now, and we call this our 15% solution. You don't have control of 85%, but you probably can do something without permission and additional resources within 15%. If people make a tiny little shift, our chances of making a larger shift increase proportionally. If you want to say, we just want to change the way we work, and boom, I would put the pessimist hat firmly on. But if you're willing to think about what tiny shifts, a colleague of ours has worked as a coach at Microsoft, and he works with leaders and how they work with their teams. And they make a plan, they go into the meeting, and the leader falls back in the old practice. And he now has the permission and the trust to say, didn't we say we were going to do that a little differently? Let's rewind the tape and run it again. Yeah. And when you get to that level of relationship, and dare I say trust, and I have a lot of challenges with the word trust in how it shows up or doesn't, then we can begin to make changes in the individual leader and the team and the group. But that requires a commitment to change. And people are often, that's not what they're inviting you in for. Let's just get this done, right?
Yeah, and that's the autocratic mindset that I'm thinking of, Nancy. This thing of just get the outcome that I want to achieve, and I'll bring in a facilitator, and I'll bring in an expert, and I'll bring in a doctor, and I'll bring in somebody, and just get me the outcome that I'm looking for. So that's that mindset. So it's interesting that it's not that liberating structures can deal with that mindset, But a key point that I'm inferring from what you're saying then is that it actually requires a recognition that the organization is systemic, that the organization is not unitary, that it's not amenable to unitary thinking, that
Yeah.
it's about the connections and the relationships between all of the micro elements. So when you said there, let's notice the micro interactions before we start trying to influence or change or alter the bigger or macro. Does that ever come up as an explicit requirement? Because everything you're saying, to my hearing, suggests that if you don't have that systemic perspective of organizations, it might be a little bit challenging to see where the benefits of this liberating structures will come from.
I'm trying to think of a short response to that, because I think there's so many ways that these the organisms that we call organizations operate at so many levels, is that people often have a high level sense that it's a system, but understanding how that operationalizes in the day-to-day is the difference. And that stuff sometimes is pretty mundane. So I think you also have to think that you can do some work without pushing on the systemic view initially.
Yeah.
You're going to arrive there. Because at some point you're going to do, I mean, one of the things I love is creative destruction. It used to be called TRIZ, because we changed the title because it borrowed from another methodology and caused confusion. So now we cause confusion for the people who knew it as TRIZ. But it asks you to design for perfect failure. And you don't tell people you're designing for perfect failure the first time you run it, though you can run this multiple times. Even when people know what's coming, it still works. You have them design in small groups for, how can the pie festival be the worst possible pie festival ever to happen in our town? And they work in small groups. They make a list of everything they need to do to make sure it fails absolutely. And, we can share it between the groups. There's variations here. But now take that list, and I want you to put a check mark by everything we already are actually doing. And we are already repeating things that lead to failure. We know they lead to failure, but we still do them. And one of the most powerful ways for people to understand they have a lever into a system is to understand what they can stop doing instead of start doing. We have created an additive culture. We can do more with less people, more with less people, more with less people, right? Well, what if we stop doing something? What would that make room for? What would change in the system? And then people start understanding that a system isn't something you can snap your fingers and change, and you can influence it. You can find what edges of that system are open or vulnerable to influence, and do experiments on those edges, reflect on them, and decide, do I keep working that edge, or am I going to try a different edge? And so it's something as simple as figuring out what to stop doing can open that door. But intellectually just head on into it. That works for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah, and it's typically not the starting point from which the facilitator is brought in. The facilitator is brought in to, I'm looking to try and get this outcome. Help me set it up to get to wherever I'm trying to go.
Or the performative nod to complexity and systems, which is another thing. Whenever someone says, I want to do a consultation, red flag, because are you just ticking the box?
Yeah.
And I worked in international development for many years, and that was a big box ticking exercise. And we want to work with our whole system. And can you tell me what you mean by that in your organization? I have a systems approach. What does that mean in day-to-day practice? So, conceptually, fine, but what does it mean in day-to-day practice? Sorry, I didn't turn my phone on.
No, we have to be mindful of the time, Martin, as our viewers are following us since 44 minutes ago, and we're reaching that critical spot where LinkedIn Live viewers disappear because they have to do something else.
The time flies. It's maybe it's an opportune time, Paul, to try and do a a little roundup of some of the key points. I suppose to start off, my opening observation was liberating structures, that I'd never heard of it. So Nancy, you've very kindly taken us on a whirlwind journey through the concept of liberating structures. And your opening comment was that it's pattern language, which is kind of interesting, because you then introduced us to the idea of the 5 micro standards, and the diagram that you showed us, where they were almost atomized. So they weren't in any particular sequence or flow, although they could be applied in a sequence. But actually, they're more about an awareness of the key elements, 5 key elements that make up any event that a facilitator might look to actually engage with. That took us then to noticing and looking into the actual patterns of interaction. And you said you have 43 in total, and that 10 of those are relatively new, that you're doing an updated version of the book that was originally authored 2013, 2014, if I recall correctly. Mm-hmm. The linking of patterns of interaction within the group, and how, as the facilitator, the 43 patterns offer you almost like a menu of ways in which to recognize what's happening within the group. So again, it's not that they're prescriptively to be applied in sequence, it's that they're to be used as lenses through which we as facilitators can observe a group and then help the group to get to where the group in the moment appears to be wanting to bring itself. Mm-hmm. Now, that then introduced us, or you introduced us to the concept of liberating structures being very useful, particularly useful for helping to manage complex situations. And my question to you was, so what does complex situation actually mean? And you suggested that it's about if there's an unpredictable outcome. So typical meetings might have an agenda, might have predetermined decisions that have to be made, conversations that have to be had, but there's a pretty much determined outcome, and it might be less beneficial versus the scenario where we've got an agenda, but we're not quite sure what decisions we have to make because we haven't reached any decision points yet. So ferreting out of the group where decisions might have to be made and where the outcomes are uncertain is what we're considering to be complex scenarios for the purpose of liberating structures. You mentioned KNOT working, which we didn't get to explore. So we might have to come back to that one, Nancy, for another occasion, perhaps with your colleague that you mentioned.
Oh, yeah, that could be a good idea.
We could perhaps have a future conversation. But the overall concept of liberating structures, you suggested that it's actually a way to design and run meetings. And a key element of that design piece in particular, as I'm inferring it, is we're looking to design in ways that as many, if not all, of the participants can fully contribute according to their own capacities, desires, interests, and so on. So I introduced the idea of open space because it sounded a little bit open space-esque to me, but actually you said you've practiced as an open space practitioner, and you said some of the elements of the liberating structures are directly drawn from open space, but it's actually bigger and broader than just the open space methodology. A key point that you brought us to at the very end, which for me is so fundamental, I think, is that noticing what's happening at micro level, at individual interaction levels, is fundamental before we can get to noticing and analyzing what's happening at the interactions at the broader macro level. And that liberating structures and organizing meetings through the use of liberating structures probably provides us with the best methodology or framework to enable that noticing of the micro level engagements and interactions, which will then help us to get to the macro level and understanding of the macro level organization interactions that are typically taking place. Finally, I'll say your phrase, Nancy, create space to do something different. If I was to sum up the whole conversation as I've heard it, I think the idea of creating, liberating structures can help to create space for a group to do stuff that's a bit different.
And we call that higher order goals too. Is that they could do more than they could ever imagine they could do. And they go from a meeting that you think doesn't need liberating structures. You know, we have an agenda and we have report outs and we have decisions. When no one's engaged, that is not a simple meeting solution. It's a complex problem that needs addressing. And when we unleash and engage everyone, things that can happen that we never imagined could happen.
Never imagined, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, dear viewers, thank you so much for staying with us that long, and I hope that you enjoyed this program. As we are definitely, I was delighted to produce it here with our guest today, Nancy White, renowned facilitator. Nancy, thank you so much for your time. And my dear co-host, meeting Dr. Martin Duffy, as usual, summarizing this conversation brilliantly in these last 4 minutes. So friends, stay tuned. Maybe we have more surprises for you. Maybe we can decide to have Keith, actually the inventor of the Liberating Structures framework, in our program. That will be amazing. And perhaps also with Nancy to make the segue on the conversation. We're just finishing here. It's not over. It's not over.
It's
so
stay tuned. Beginning.
Yes. Stay tuned, everybody, and see you soon.
Yeah. Thank you all. Many thanks, Nancy. Great speaking to you.